Hi, I'm Urvashi Bitsray from TwoSleevers.com, and I'm walking you through a series of how to adapt a recipe for a pressure cooker. And in the first video in this series, I talked about how pressure cookers are different, what makes them different, so I hope you watched that small video really quick. Now I'm going to talk about what that means. What are the implications, what are the typical adjustments that you will need to make because pressure cookers operate differently than slow cookers and cooking on a stove top or cooking in an oven. Okay, so the first thing we talked about in the previous video was less water evaporates because it's a very contained environment. Okay, the implications for that are the first thing, the absolute first thing you're going to have to do is when you look at a regular recipe for stovetop, etc., you're going to have to reduce time. You're going to have to reduce water. Those are the two things that are just absolute essentials. Things cook faster and things need less water because water doesn't evaporate. So when I'm cooking meats and vegetables, actually, especially if they're vegetables that give off water, some examples of this would be peppers, like, sweet peppers, tomatoes, onions, things like that, squash, those things let out water, summer squash. So in those instances, I immediately reduce the water. Now on the flip side, there are vegetables that are extremely starchy, or pasta, or beans. These things have starch, and in order for that starch to cook, they absorb water. In those cases, while you will reduce the water, it won't be nearly as much. So when I look at a meat, like, I make a lamb rogan josh, it's on the blog, TwoSleevers.com. In a situation like that, I cut the water immediately, and I use like maybe 1/4 of a cup of water, and I expect the meat and the vegetables and the yogurt to release the rest of the water. When I'm cooking beans or I'm cooking potatoes or pasta, I can't do that. For pasta, for example, for every 4 ounces of pasta, you need about 8 ounces of water at least. That's a good sort of rule of thumb to operate by. So what I would do if I were you is look at the thing that's going to take the longest to cook, the meat or the vegetable or the potatoes, and look up cooking charts to say how much water do they typically take. That's the best way to adjust it. Over time you'll be able to guesstimate, but initially you might struggle with that a bit. So look up these reputable charts and figure out how long it's going to take. One thing you do need to be aware of, because the water doesn't evaporate, you cannot do sauce reductions. So you know how sometimes you will reduce a sauce to concentrate the flavor, like a wine reduction, or you'll concentrate the broth down. That's not going to happen in a pressure cooker because it's going to maintain all of the water inside. So look at the recipe and see if it's one that is calling for a reduction, and then just think through how you're going to do that. You may have to do that after the food is cooked, but it's not going to happen within that pot, obviously. Okay, remember when I said, all of these things need some water to cook. Meats, vegetables, yogurt, and when I say vegetables, I'm not counting starchy vegetables. So like, potatoes is a classic example, one that actually needs water. Those things, however, meats and vegetables typically release water. If you look up my butter chicken recipe, people are always saying, am I really not going to put any water? It's just a can of tomatoes and chicken? Yes. And it's going to make so much sauce because the tomatoes are going to release water and the chicken releases water. So you end up with a ton of really delicious sauce. But just keep that principle in mind. The starchy foods we've already talked about, pasta, 4 ounces of pasta, 8 ounces of water. And then the other thing to remember is you cannot make dishes that are supposed to end up dry. So if you're making sort of, soups, stews, braises, that works really, really easily. If you need to make a dry thing like rice, for example, right? I typically do that pot and pot. So if you watch my pot and pot video, you'll get an idea of how you can make things that are relatively dry, but you can't do that in the inner liner of your pot. The faster cook times, as I mentioned earlier, the best thing to do is to look up charts. If you're making, like, say, a 2-pound pork roast, chop it up so that you can increase the Maillard reaction. You should watch the Maillard reaction video. But you can chop it up and then you can look at the times and say, okay, this takes 20 minutes, which means I can't do squash at the same time because, my zucchini takes 1 minute or less under low pressure. So just think through that, but look up the charts and figure out how long it's going to take. Okay. I mentioned this in the first video. So because things cook at a different pace in the pressure cooker, the less dense something is, the more water it contains, like fish, like light vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, etc., the faster they're going to cook. The more dense something is, like meat or artichokes, or potatoes, those things are going to take longer to cook. So in a slow cooker, you could dump everything in. In a pressure cooker, you're not going to be able to do that. If you watch the 4th video I'm going to do, it shows you how to make a beef stew with multiple vegetables, but you just have to do that in stages. So just be aware of that. The one thing that's pretty important is you cannot afford for anything to scorch in there. So thick things are typical culprits. So like if you use like a really thick tomato sauce, or if you're using I had this arroz con pollo recipe on the blog, and it took me many, many times of making it because I was using these pureed vegetables that were really, really thick, and they kept scorching. And one of the things that you have to do in a situation like that is you put your rice, you put your vegetables, and then you pour the thick sauce on top and do not stir it. So when you're making spaghetti with meatballs and you want to put jarred spaghetti sauce, you just pour it on the top and do not stir it. Don't let that thick thing stick to the bottom of the pot. So be really careful how you do that. And I mentioned in the first video that certain things don't act the same under pressure. So dairy and coconut milk are the ones that I encounter in my cooking a lot. Here's what I've learned with dairy that really, really helps. So if you're cooking with yogurt, for example, and you don't want it to curdle. So for example, I have a chicken curry with yogurt and spinach recipe on TwoSleevers.com. And by the way, it's also in my cookbook, which is Indian Instant Pot. It's on Amazon. You may have seen the cover earlier. But when you're cooking dairy, for example, what you want is you want full fat yogurt. Okay, the skim ones are more likely to separate. That's number one. Number two, you really want to whip it. So I blend the heck out of it because really what you want is the most homogeneous mixture you can get. And then the third thing that I find really helps is to put a little starch in it. So I might put corn flour, I might put besan, which is chickpea flour. Some people put arrowroot flour because they're trying to keep the carbs low. But if you mix all of those things in, the dairy is less likely to separate. So also with coconut milk. So normally I look for coconut milk that doesn't have starch in it. If I'm cooking in the pressure cooker, I might allow it to have a little gum in it, and that helps. But I'll do another series on the buttons you need. The other thing that really helps is if you don't want something to boil and curdle, what you might need to do is look for the soup setting on your Instant Pot or your other pressure cooker, and find something that doesn't boil the heck out of that dairy, and that's what's going to keep it from curdling. So we've talked about a lot here. I've talked about the various ways in which you have to adjust. Reduce water, reduce time. Look at the fastest cooking ingredient and see, look at the slowest cooking ingredient and see if those two things can be cooked at the same time. Don't put things that are going to scorch in it. If you have something that's really thick, make sure you put it on top. Look at the difference between starchy vegetables and beans and pasta versus fast cooking ones that have a lot of water, and decide how much water you're going to need to put in. And just be aware that certain foods don't act the same. So we talked about dairy, we talked about coconut milk. Okay, this was a little bit of a longer video, but next I'm going to talk about how to adapt recipes for stovetop, slow cooker, and oven. So let's say you have one of those recipes, the next video is going to talk about how you do that. And I'm Urvashi from TwoSleevers.com, and this is the book that I was referencing earlier, so I hope you'll check it out on Amazon. Thank you.